Dark fantasy often feels cringy, like a sick, twisted joke. And I've often thought about why I hate so many dark fantasy novels. And today I'm here to tell you why. Hello, and welcome back to the Book Love Podcast, where we go beyond the pages in front of us. I'm Matt from Ohio, and if you'll indulge me for a little bit, I want to talk about why dark fantasy so often fails and then how and why it can succeed. Now, I'll be honest and upfront with you. I haven't read many dark fantasy novels in like at least 5 years because they were always so disappointing in the past that I grew away from them. But I recently read one that renewed my faith in the genre and made me think about why I was always disappointed with the other books. And I'm going to talk to you about all of those things specifically. So let's get into it. Starting with, what is dark fantasy? Listen, all right. Dark fantasy is not high fantasy where there are clear heroes that go on noble quests against obviously evil things, right? Dark fantasy is not horror where the point is to scare the reader. Dark fantasy is meant to immerse you in a world where fear is a tool instead of the goal. Dark fantasy is not supposed to be violence for the sake of violence or shock for the sake of shock. It's not supposed to be confusing without a purpose, right? It's not grimdark or grim noir writing. It's still a fantasy story. So, with that being said, dark fantasy is fantasy that blends traditional fantasy elements with horror, moral ambiguity, and like a bleaker, unsettling tone, right? Heroes are flawed, they're compromised, they're morally gray. But guess what? Villains are the same thing. And they might even be understandable or justified or logical. You know, the world feels dangerous. It feels oppressive. It feels decaying where violence, corruption, and betrayal are present. They're not sanitized. They're there. Magic is dangerous. It's corrupting. It's morally compromising. Authority is unstable and often earned through violence and magic. Um, and like gaining power will always maybe require some type of sacrifice. Hope exists, but it's fragile and often very temporary in dark fantasy. And I always think that sounds so awesome. So why does it fail so much? It fails all the time. Let's go through some examples, right? I'm going to start with one. And this is an example of why dark fantasy fails, but not why a book is bad, okay? The Sword of Truth series by Terry Goodkind. I loved this series. Loved it. I think it's it's great. It is, in hindsight, it's a little bit whitewashed. It's a little bit patriarchal. It's a little bit chauvinistic, but I still loved this series. It is structurally epic, high fantasy, but tonally, it employs a lot of dark fantasy elements. And I think that is the problem. So many fantasies fall into a weird niche. They want to be higher epic fantasy, but they want to explore elements of dark fantasy. And this results in sort of a happy world where violence is used for shock value or punishment to the characters. Um, and specifically with the Sword of Truth, I think the characters are not changed by all of the bad stuff that happens. In fact, often their goodness seems reinforced by it. They rise above it. And that is a mark of epic fantasy. It's not a mark of dark fantasy. And so therefore the dark fantasy elements in the Sword of Truth end up becoming like torture porn or death for the sake of death, gore for the sake of gore, torture because of it. And that's some stuff I don't always like getting behind. Um, Another way that dark fantasy fails is, let's look at Game of Thrones or A Song of Ice and Fire. Now, very clearly, this was a successful book series and a very successful TV show. I mean, for some people, A Song of Ice and Fire is more an interrogation of power and an exemplification of the fragility of structure and hierarchy. But I'm not one of those people. Sorry, not sorry. I could not get past book 3. For me, violence does not equal intensity or depth. Unpredictability does not equate to complexity or meaning. And brutality is not the same thing as insights into a character. I think George R. R. Martin does a good job of employing morally gray characters, but the way in which they're more morally gray, coupled with the concept that he's never going to finish the series, ultimately like fetishizes cruelty while withholding payoff for all of it. You can't even convince me that being patient is worthwhile here because there is no ending. And on top of that, I once had an author tell me that if they ever get stuck writing, the answer is just to kill off a character and then figure out how all the other characters are going to deal with that or how they're going to respond to it, and your narrative moves forward. And ever since I heard that, um, the A Song of Ice and Fire series, that's what it is, and it just makes me think that George R. R. Martin is a writer who gets writer's block all the time and just has to kill off characters to figure out where they're. And I'm sure that's not the case. I'm sure it's not the case, but that's the connection my brain has made. I think a third example of how dark fantasy can often fail is that I think instead of employing emotional or existential meaning and impact, I think authors will oftentimes implement chaos, right? So let's talk about Malazon, Book of the Fallen, or the Malazon series. What I don't even remember the name of the series, but Malazon, Book of the Fallen. Obviously, this is an amazing series. I read it, I liked it, but I also didn't like it. Right? It let me down. I've met readers that say this is complex and it rewards patience and it's deep and philosophical. And I can see glimmers of that praise in there, but I also read it as narrative opacity as gatekeeping and suffering without any emotional connection and chaos masquerading as clever complexity and profundity. I think that dark fantasy novels like Malazon are not accessible for readers. And I think it tries to market itself, or at least readers try to market it as we're smarter than. You have to be really smart to get this. And I don't think that's the purpose of books. But how does dark fantasy succeed? Let's go through some examples of this. I think dark fantasy can succeed when the world is real and it's not just violence for the sake of violence. I think that dark fantasy can succeed when characters are perfectly morally gray. And I think it can succeed when there are no character arcs. And I think it can succeed when the darkness and the brutality shape the characters and inform them psychologically, right? When things are there for a reason. So let's go through some examples of that, right? Okay. The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang. I think that this succeeds because it grounds the brutality of the world in real life historical 20th century Chinese history. It's almost enlightens readers about history and says this actually happened, as opposed to inventing unimaginable atrocities because. And and I think it also succeeds in making you in having a justifiably bad character, right? It follows a character as they become a ruthless leader, and you think, well, that makes sense. And like, and you're like, I don't I was like, but you feel bad that you love, and you're like, it's all logical, right? Um, Another example of this is the Broken Empire series by Mark Lawrence. This series employs the concept of no redemption arcs for a character. Um, and yet you can't help but root for this character who is so beyond the uh, point of moral depravity. This is dark fantasy done right. It has psychological depth to the point where you ask yourself if you're a good person because you find yourself agreeing with and rooting for this horrible, horrible main character. Also, um, the concept of a world that is fantasy, but then might be post apocalyptic, like it's almost like meta dark fantasy with the world building. And I think that is very successful and very cool. Uh, a third example of successful dark fantasy is the First Law series by Joe Abercrombie. First, this series might border on like grimdark instead of dark fantasy. I'll let you be the judge of that. But secondly, I know that some people compare it to Game of Thrones, and I just talked about why Game of Thrones I think is fails in the dark fantasy world. But I think that the First Law series by Joe Abercrombie is better for a couple of reasons. First, I think that its morally gray characters are amazing because this series focuses on bad people doing the right thing and good people doing the wrong thing. And I've always found that to be very captivating. Whereas in Game of Thrones, it's often bad people doing the wrong thing and getting away with it, but others thinking that they're not bad, if that makes sense. And then the good people doing the good thing and being punished for it, which is just a different trope, but I don't think it's quite as impactful in a dark fantasy setting. Also, with the First Law series, the world isn't just brutal, there's a lot of battles in it. And the battles are not sanitized. They're gory, they're brutal, they're effective, they're visceral, they're amazing. And I think it's a little bit next level. Combining the two together, right? Unlike traditional novels where characters transform into better versions of themselves, this is called a character arc. The First Law series often portrays how difficult it is for people to truly change. And this actually results in like character circles where they end up where they began. Like, I think that that is dark in of itself when change is hopeless. And I think that is a really good employment of the dark fantasy trope. Lastly, is Rise of the Shadow Lords by Sarah Samuels. Now, I just recently did an entire book review of this. I will link it in the show notes below. If you're watching this on YouTube, I'll find a way to link it somewhere here. So I'm not going to go too far into this because I have an entirely dedicated video to it. But here's why it succeeds, right? This book is a perfect example of what dark fantasy is supposed to be, right? Every violent moment serves a clear purpose within the larger progression of the story and even the series. Even if that purpose isn't immediately obvious, there's always a payoff, most of the time within the same book, right? Um, I got scared reading this. Uh, I wasn't scared for the characters, but I was scared for the characters. I wasn't scared for myself. I wasn't scared for my virgin brain. I wasn't, it wasn't shock for shock's sake. This isn't violence in the vein of Saw or Hostel. It isn't there to titillate or overwhelm, right? Their brutality is meant to break someone. It's meant to change someone. It's meant to shape who they become. It, and then that ultimately creates real motivations, shared history, and the emotional and psychological foundation for everything that follows. And so the darkness isn't the thing that you focus on in the story. You still focus on the fantasy, the characters, the story. The darkness of the dark fantasy informs that stuff. And that's why I think Rise of the Shadow Lords is the example of how dark fantasy succeeds. And not for nothing, I will point out this is the only one that I've read that's written by a female, and I do think that there is some je ne sais quoi thing that female authors have for writing characters and making them more. I'll do another video on my thoughts on that, though. Anyhow, so those are my thoughts on dark fantasy. What dark fantasy is, in my opinion, also how it has disappointed me and how examples of why it fails, but often then how it can succeed. What I want to know is, what do you think of dark fantasy? Do you have a favorite or even least favorite book, character, series? Let me know in the comments down below. I really want to discuss this with some more people. And with that, I think I'll go ahead and put a bookmark in it for now. But I will be back with more book reviews, more bookish thoughts, more author interviews, and buddy reads with my bookish best friend, Becca. So if you'd like to contact me, if you'd like to work with me, just talk. All my contact information is in the description down below. So until next time, cheers.